Hello everyone, welcome back to History 3560. In this video we're going to discuss the American soldier, or rather the Anglo-American soldier from the early 1600s when the first English colonies were founded in the Americas to the years preceding the American Revolutionary War, about the 1760s. We'll discuss three different classes of troops: militiamen, rangers, and eventually provincial troops. We'll talk about these types of soldiers' missions, their background and their training, and their arms and their equipment. We'll also provide some additional background information about the wars that were fought in colonial America. Here's a list of some of the major colonial American wars fought in the 1600s. First, we have the Anglo-Powhatan Wars, which were fought from about 1609 intermittently to the 1670s. Some of those wars were discussed in previous videos. Then we have the Pequot War of 1636 to 1638, which was fought in New England, also discussed in a previous video. The English takeover of Dutch New Netherland in 1664. We have King Philip or Metacom's War, fought in the 1670s, also in New England. This war was discussed in a previous video also. And then we have King William's War, 1688 through 1697, which was fought in New England and parts of what is now Canada. Like the others, this war was discussed in a previous video. We'll start by discussing early colonial soldiers in the 1600s. As you remember from the first video we watched in this course, initial interactions between European colonists and Native Americans could often be very violent, with these peoples fighting wars against each other. Occasionally, the European colonists had indigenous allies, sometimes they did not. And of course, as you know from the previous video, Native American peoples were very skilled in warfare. They had military traditions of their own, and to make things more difficult for the early European colonists, in some cases, Native American warriors were better fighters than the European colonists. Many European colonists were soldiers, but many had only taken up military training after arriving in the so-called New World. A lot of Native American warriors were very strong physically. A life of hunting and a life of warfare had made them muscular. The diets that they ate made them tall, in some cases much taller than Europeans at that time in history, as you can see on this slide. This is a Powhatan warrior fighting against an English soldier from Jamestown, and the Powhatan warrior is towering over the English soldier. He's at least a head taller. Because of the strained relations, to say the least, between the early English colonists and Native Americans, the English colonies set up militias, copying the military traditions of the British Isles, which we discussed in a previous video. Many of the early settlers, especially at Jamestown, had been soldiers in Europe. A good example is Captain John Smith on the left-hand side of this slide. Captain John Smith was discussed in a previous video. The English colonists brought arms, equipment, and tactics and strategy used in Europe to their New World colonies. Elements of the military revolution can be seen in their tactics and strategy, as well as the arms and equipment they used. They wore armor in the beginning, they had iron weapons, and they used gunpowder arms, like muskets and artillery. Some of these military revolution elements worked well in the New World, as seen in the Spanish conquest of Mexico, but other elements did not work as well, particularly in North America, where the Native American populations were smaller. The armor worn by early English colonial soldiers and militiamen provided good protection against Native American arrows and projectile weapons, but wearing armor was loud, it was heavy, and expensive. The gunpowder muskets used by early English colonists, especially the matchlocks, were powerful, but they were very heavy, they were very inaccurate, and they're slow to load, and they're unreliable in inclement weather, rainstorms, snowstorms, high winds. Additionally, matchlock muskets, because they're so heavy, they have to be used with a monopod to steady the barrel, making them all the more difficult and cumbersome to use. Additionally, hand-to-hand combat was often a losing proposition for English colonial soldiers. Even though they had iron weapons, and in many cases armor, Native American warriors were often bigger and stronger than they were, making the use of ranged weapons like muskets all the more important. Here are some images of matchlock muskets. You can see the mechanism by which the matchlock is fired. It has a trigger, and it has a device called a serpentine, which holds the match. In a rainstorm, the match could be put out, and then the matchlock musket is useless. It's basically a giant unwieldy club. Here at the bottom of the slide, we see a bandolier. These objects here are cartridges, which would have held powder and bullets or shot. Musketeers would have loaded these cartridges before going into combat, and then they would have poured them down the barrel of their matchlocks. You can also see the monopod described in a previous slide, which would have helped the musketeer steady his aim because of how heavy the matchlock muskets were and because of how much recoil they had. Again, I want to emphasize the matchlock musket is very powerful, but it's unwieldy and it's very difficult to use. Native Americans had very little interest in using matchlock muskets, but they will adopt later European firearms, which we'll talk about more in this video. Here are some images of modern historical reenactors demonstrating the use of matchlock muskets. I just want to emphasize that matchlock muskets were decent weapons when they were used by a group of soldiers or musketeers, but they're not a very good weapon to be used by a single soldier isolated by himself, perhaps in the woods. The matchlock musket is unwieldy. It makes a lot of noise, alerting enemies to his presence, and of course it's inaccurate, meaning there's a good chance he would miss his assailants, and it's very slow to load. So a musketeer who has used his musket would be very vulnerable until he had reloaded. These drawbacks are additional reasons why Native American warriors did not want to use matchlock muskets. Here are some modern historical reenactors firing a reproduction of a 17th century, 1600 style artillery piece. Artillery was an important part of the military revolution, would have been very effective against slow-moving targets or against Native American settlements, but it would not have been as effective against small Native American raiding parties, unless the party had been spotted from a long distance. The introduction of flintlock muskets significantly changed colonial warfare. Flintlock muskets were invented in the early 1500s, but they did not become standard issue small arms in Europe until about the 1660s. And they did not become standard issue in the Americas until the late 1600s. It took even longer for flintlocks to be adopted in the Americas, primarily due to their high price. Flintlocks are much more reliable than matchlocks, but they're a lot more expensive, and militias being strapped for cash were slow to adopt them. One of the reasons why they're more reliable is because they use a flint rather than a match to fire. The flint, shown here on the slide, rubs up against a pan, or rather what is called the fizzen, which is attached to the pan. The flint scratches against the frizzen, which protects a small amount of powder in the pan from getting wet from rain or snow. This creates a spark which ignites the powder charge and fires the flintlock musket. They're still pretty inaccurate because they're smoothbore, just like the matchlock muskets, but they're much easier to use in rain and in snow. They're less heavy as well. They can be carried more easily. They don't require a monopod to be accurate. It's a major technological improvement over the matchlock muskets. And Native Americans noticed this, and they're very quick to adopt flintlock muskets because flintlock muskets are easier to use, they're more reliable, and they're much more mobile. They fit with the kind of tactics used by the eastern woodlands peoples, that is, stealth-based, small unit, squadron tactics, where stealth is important. Matchlocks don't work well with stealth, but flintlocks are somewhat better because they're easier to carry, they're easier to load, and they're more reliable. There is a downside, of course, with Native Americans adopting flintlocks. As the Native Americans adopt flintlock muskets, they use bows and arrows far less, but Native Americans were not making flintlock muskets or making musket balls and gunpowder for themselves. They had to purchase these goods from Europeans. And of course, if Europeans decide to stop selling muskets and gunpowder to them, then their flintlocks are useless, are no good. Scholars believe one of the reasons that King Philip's War happened in the 1670s was because the colonists of New England decided to stop selling flintlock muskets and gunpowder to the Wampanoag tribe. Now we'll discuss the background and training of the militia of the 1600s. The militiamen were citizen soldiers. They were males, age 16 to 60. Service was semi-compulsory and generally seen as being a requirement for citizenship in the colony. It was expected that males who wanted to become full citizens of the colony, they would serve in the militia. But they would also work civilian careers in between their service. Officers in the militia tended to be veteran professional soldiers, people like John Smith or Miles Standish amongst the Plymouth colonists. And they would train the citizen soldier civilian militiamen under their command. Also, wealthy or gentry members of these colonial societies would become officers, and they would use their wealth to provide equipment, clothing, or weapons to the militiamen in their command. In general, it was expected that a militiaman would provide his own arms and provide his own equipment, but a poor man who wanted to join the militia might have to get these things provided to him by his commander. The colonial government did not pay for arms and equipment. All of the equipment was handled by either individual militiamen or by the militia unit as a whole. These militias would come together in town squares and they would train, oftentimes on the weekends. This training was meant to be somewhat entertaining. It was often accompanied by a feast after the training and marching had been completed. Militiamen might play sports or gamble as well after the training had been completed, and often there was alcohol consumption during these training exercises. Americans or Anglo-Americans in the 1600s didn't think that alcohol was a bad thing. They didn't think that it was a depressant that could obviously make you sick if drunk too much. They actually regarded alcohol as a stimulant. And that idea, that belief that alcohol is a stimulant is going to be common until actually the 1800s. Of course, these militiamen cost the colonial governments basically nothing since they provided their own arms and equipment. As I mentioned, individual militiamen were supposed to provide their own firearms, their own clothing, their own armor if they chose to. If they didn't have money themselves, they could borrow from the units fund, the militia units fund. This equipment was not paid for by the colonial governments in most cases. Now we can discuss the appearance of colonial American militia men in the 1600s. Obviously, there's so many militia units spread across so many colonies. We're going to be discussing in broad strokes here. You don't see standardized uniforms at this point in American history. In fact, standardized uniforms really aren't common anywhere in the West at this point. It's not until about the early 1700s or the late 1600s, as a result of reforms made by French King Louis XIV. Other European countries in the late 1600s and early 1700s will copy Louis XIV's French uniform model. But in the early 1600s, you don't see uniforms like you do today. Instead, religion often played a role in the style of clothing worn by militiamen. Anglican militiamen in places like Virginia, for example, they liked fitted clothing, tight vests and jackets called doublets, seen on this militiaman here. They really liked bright colors and vivid designs. They were interesting to look at, although they're not very tactically advantageous in the Americas when you're trying to use stealth-based warfare. If anything, it makes you more of a target for your enemies. Soldiers who were from the Puritan colonies were more likely to wear looser-fitting clothing called small clothes. They also wore muted colors, browns, dark greens, dark purple even. These were called sad colors. And they were considered to be more modest than the bright colors worn by Anglicans because the Puritans wanted to differentiate themselves from the Anglicans, as we discussed in previous videos. Armor was worn earlier in the 1600s, but it became less common over time. As Native Americans adopted flintlock firearms, armor was less useful. A musket ball could penetrate this armor, or if it didn't penetrate the armor, it would still wound a soldier underneath the armor by causing bruising, contusions, breaking of bones. Armor becomes less efficacious over time, so a lot of colonial soldiers stopped wearing it by the end of the 1600s. Additionally, colonial Anglo-American soldiers were beginning to adopt new tactics and strategy when they were fighting Native Americans. Rather than fighting in close order drill, as they'd been taught to do by the military revolution, now they were fighting using small unit tactics, squadrons of small groups of soldiers. They were also getting stealthier, using what was called in the vernacular of the 1600s the skulking way of war. And armor is not very compatible with stealth-based warfare. It's too loud, it makes the wearer too slow, it's not ideal. Other things like hair regulations. Not really standardized at this point, but religious influence is evident here as well. Puritan men preferred shorter hair, what was often called the roundhead haircut, similar to a modern day bowl cut. Not very stylish, but very practical. Anglican men preferred longer hair, similar to the Cavaliers of the English Civil War. Wigs became popular at the end of the 1600s, but they're not very practical, typically worn more by officers than enlisted soldiers. Facial hair becomes less common across the century and pretty much falls out of style by the early 1700s amongst Anglo-American soldiers. In addition to militia soldiers, the English colonies in North America also relied on rangers. Rangers spent a lot more time on the frontier than militiamen. They made their careers living on the frontier, hunting, trapping, trading with Native Americans. Because of their interactions with Native Americans, they had an element of cultural syncretism in how they trained for warfare and how they armed themselves and dressed themselves. They adopted elements of Native American dress, especially moccasins. Moccasins were much more comfortable than the hard leather shoes worn by the average Euro-American colonist. Keep in mind that left and right shoes aren't going to become common until the American Civil War. So soft leather moccasins are much more comfortable. They're also much quieter, once again helping what was called the skulking way of war. At the same time, though, these Rangers also used European tactics and strategy as well. They really focused on destroying Native American settlements as a way of forcing Native Americans to surrender. This is called irregular warfare. Irregular warfare is when a military specifically targets civilian assets that assist an enemy military. The Rangers played a major role in the English victory in King Philip's War in the 1670s by targeting Wampanoag settlements and by engaging in stealth warfare. Modern U.S. Special Forces, especially units like the 75th Ranger Regiment, they wear a tan beret in honor of the first Rangers. The tan evokes the image of buckskin, basically tracing the Rangers, the modern Rangers, back to the old frontier soldiers. Moving on to the 18th century, in the 1700s, militias were still an essential part of the colonial armed forces. They had similar training, mustering on the weekends, training and then having a nice meal and alcoholic beverages after training was over. The uniforms they wore are going to become more common and standardized during the 1700s, once again reflecting the European adoption of uniforms. At the same time, you're still going to see quite a few civilian pieces of clothing being worn as well. Out on the frontier, Rangers played a major role in frontier warfare, especially the last French and Indian War of 1754 to 1763. And of course, Rangers are going to be active in the American Revolutionary War as well as light infantry. In the 1700s, you're also going to see the development of provincial troops. Provincial troops were professional soldiers. They were volunteers who were hired by colonial governments, and they would serve for longer terms than militia men would, and they would receive some kind of compensation for their service. They would also receive uniforms and arms paid for by the colonial government. These provincial units, which were used primarily in the French and Indian War, they're going to form the basis for the Continental Army, the regular army, the professional army of the American patriots during the American Revolutionary War. So in the 1700s, you have Rangers and you have militias, just like the 1600s, but you have the addition of provincial troops in the 1700s. Here are just some of the major colonial American wars that took place in the 1700s. in which the Anglo-American colonies were involved. You have Queen Anne's War from 1704 to 1713, which was the English versus the Spanish colonies. This was an English victory. The Spanish had some support from France and from Native American allies. The English had Native American allies as well, including the very powerful, militarily powerful Iroquois Confederation. After this, you have King George's War, 1744 to 1748, which was the English versus the French colonies. It was a draw. Nothing was really accomplished or changed in the American colonies. Both sides had Native American allies in King George's War. And then the last major colonial war in which the English or Anglo-American colonies were involved was the French and Indian War. This, of course, was an English victory. Unlike the previous wars I've mentioned, this war started in the American colonies, arguably by American colonists. I discussed the start and causes of the French and Indian War in a previous video. In between these large wars, the Anglo-American colonies fought the French-Canadian colonies, and they fought Native American tribes as well. Now we'll discuss the appearance and equipment of 1700s colonial militia. By this point, they are using flintlock muskets as the standard small arm. Some militiamen will also use long rifles. Usually these rifles are flintlocks as well. Long rifles are much more accurate, having rifling in their barrel and having a longer barrel, but they're much slower and more difficult to load at this point in history. The militiamen are also armed with bayonets and swords for melee combat, close quarters battle, and for bayonet charges. Uniforms in the 1700s are sometimes worn by militias if they have enough money to purchase them, but more often the militias will wear civilian clothing. They'll wear waistcoats and breeches, as you can see in the slide here. Over time, they're going to adopt long trousers and what are called hunting jackets, jackets with fringe, which are a fusion of European and Native American garb. For their cover, they're going to wear tri-cornered or three-cornered hats. Wide brim hats are worn as well, as are light infantry caps. And light infantry caps look a lot like a modern day baseball cap. You'll see some examples later in this video. As far as hair regulations, long hair is the norm for men in this period. It would be tied in what was called a queue. Looks a lot like a ponytail. Wigs are still worn, but they're beginning to fall out of favor by the late 1700s. Facial hair is unpopular amongst men at this point. The only colonial American men that would have had beards would have been men on the frontier. Here are some images of small arms used by American militia in the 1700s. We see a couple of examples of flintlock muskets, including the Brown Bess musket, which was the standard issue small arm, standard issue musket of British infantry forces. The Brown Bess was made in the 1720s, and the British used it for infantrymen well into the 1850s. In addition, they sold surplus muskets across the world. You can think of the Brown Bess musket as being the 1700s equivalent of the AK-47. The Soviet Union sold AK-47s across the world. The British sold Brown Bess muskets across the world, and many of those Brown Bess muskets ended up in the hands of colonial militias. Here you can see the steps needed to load and fire a flintlock musket, specifically the Brown Bess. A well-trained soldier could fire at least 3 shots in a minute. Keep in mind that smoothbore muskets are not nearly as accurate as rifles. Typically, they can't be accurately aimed more than about 25 yards. Long rifles, however, like the one shown at the bottom of this slide, are considerably more accurate, but they're much harder to load. Instead of a simple ramrod to seat the charge, the bullet, early riflemen had to use a specialized ramrod that was shaped to fit the grooves of the barrel, and it would have to be pushed very hard to properly seat the bullet. Sometimes they might even use a small hammer to ram their bullet home. So with increased accuracy comes increased loading time. Here are some images of the bayonets that would have been used by colonial infantrymen in the 1700s. These are socket bayonets. They're designed to fit over the muzzle of the musket via a bayonet lug. They'd be placed on and turned to lock. These bayonets are three-pronged, which makes them much deadlier than a single-bladed bayonet or a knife bayonet. The socket bayonet also allows the musket to be fired even after the bayonet has been fixed, although fixing the bayonet to the muzzle of the musket makes it even less accurate than it is unencumbered. Here is an image of modern-day historical reenactors dressed as colonial militiamen. As you can see, they're wearing a variety of civilian clothing, but also the hunting jackets that were becoming popular quasi-uniforms of militiamen towards the middle of the 1700s. You'll also see that most of them are armed with smooth-bore Flintlock muskets. There's some significant benefits and downsides to militias. These benefits and downsides were true of the colonial militias of the 1600s and the 1700s, and they'll be true of the militias of the early United States, the early American Republic as well. The benefits of militias are that they're cheap. They don't cost governments very much to form. The militias will pay for their own arms and equipment. And militias provided social cohesion to colonial and early national American societies. They gave male citizens ways to come together, to work together. Militia service was an important part of citizenship, the idea of citizenship, primarily for white males. Over time, you're going to see that non-white men are barred from militia service gradually. Militias can be used in a variety of missions. They can be used to defend settlements against Native American attacks or against attacks from other hostile European powers, European colonial powers. They can also be used to prevent slave uprisings as well. We're going to see this throughout the 1700s and even into the 1800s after the United States is founded. There's some downsides as well when you're dealing with militias. One of the main ones is the lack of discipline. Militias came together occasionally, weekly or monthly, to train, but they didn't train constantly. There was no basic training that militiamen went to, like American military personnel go to today. Militiamen also did not want to be deployed far from their homes and their families. Many of them had wives and children. The range of the service range included men as young as 16 and as old as 60. So you might have had fathers or even grandfathers serving in militias. Also, the men who were in these militias, they were citizen soldiers. They had civilian occupations. They may not have wanted to leave their civilian occupations and their pay for long because they would have needed to provide for their families, and they typically did not receive pay as militiamen. And of course, the communities they're from lose these men when they're out on their deployments. the town blacksmith joins the militia. Now there's no blacksmith to shoe horses or to make plowshares for the farmers. In many cases, the farmers are gone too, so no one's growing food for the community. So with the significant upsides of militias, their low cost, their social cohesion, the types of missions they can be used for, there's significant downsides as well, in the sense that they were not as disciplined as professional soldiers. They did not want to be deployed far from home. They had civilian jobs they had to leave behind as well. So benefits and downsides. Here is just a British political cartoon mocking colonial American militiamen as being undisciplined, highlighting my previous point about the low level of discipline amongst militia units. Rangers would be important in the colonial wars of the 1700s as well. Rangers continued to operate primarily on the frontier in the 1700s. They also continued to practice cultural syncretism, adopting Native American tactics, garb, and arms. In terms of combat, Rangers were more effective than militia. They had more experience on the frontier, and they had more experience with combat. They also didn't have to leave civilian occupations behind in the way that the average militiaman would have had to. The tactics and strategy of the Rangers was well suited for combat against Native Americans because they'd mastered stealth tactics and they'd mastered irregular warfare. They could remain undetected from Native American war parties, and they could strike at Native American settlements. The Rangers' tactics also were well suited to fighting the French colonial empire. The French colonial empire was sprawling. It was very large in terms of territory, but it had a very small, sparse population. So the Rangers could penetrate deep into French territory in a way that the militias could not. The most famous of these later colonial ranger units was Rogers Rangers, founded in the New Hampshire colony at the beginning of the French and Indian War. Their leader was Robert Rogers, a man born in Massachusetts, but of Ulster Scots ancestry. It's worth noting that Rogers Rangers and Robert Rogers would fight on the British side during the American Revolutionary War, although the Patriots had their own Rangers. When it came to the arms and equipment of the Rangers, they used a mixture of European and Native American equipment. Their uniforms were a synthesis of European and Native American clothing. They often wore moccasins on their feet because they were much lighter and more comfortable than the shoes worn by Europeans. They wore jackets often made of green fabric. These would, of course, provided better camouflage than other colors. For their covers, they wore the light infantry cap that I mentioned before, which looks a little bit like a modern-day baseball cap. They also would have worn what are called the tam o' shanter or Glengarry bonnets. This is a type of Scottish headwear, highlighting the Scottish origins of many American colonists. As far as arms go, they would have used flintlock muskets primarily, but they also would have used Native American arms, like tomahawks, for example, as melee and short distance ranged weapons. Here's an image of Robert Rogers in Ranger's garb. As you can see, he's also wearing a Native American bandolier, highlighting the cultural syncretism of the Ranger units. Now we'll talk about the provincial troops that were used primarily in the French and Indian War. These units of provincial troops were organized and controlled by colonial governments like Virginia, South Carolina, Massachusetts. Unlike the militias, provincial troops typically served further from home, and they would serve for longer terms, like an entire campaign, not just for 90 days, which was the typical term of service for militias. Their uniforms and their equipment, including their weapons, their firearms, were purchased by colonial governments rather than by the individual provincial soldiers. Provincial troops were volunteers. They were not semi-conscripted the way militiamen were. They would volunteer to become provincial soldiers. Once again, they were about the same age range as the militiamen, although they tended to be from lower social classes than militiamen. Militiamen obviously had to provide their own weapons and their own clothing and equipment. The provincial soldiers, they had those things issued to them, allowing poorer men to join the provincial troops. By 1758, the provincial troops were centralized under the command of the British Crown. This centralization would inspire the creation of the Continental Army, America's first professional army during the Revolutionary War. So without the provincial troops of the French and Indian War, you might not have had the Continental Army of the American Revolutionary War. And the exploits of the Continental Army will be discussed in more detail in future videos. In conclusion, when discussing the American soldier of the 1600s and 1700s, keep in mind that there was both continuity and evolution in how these soldiers fought and how they equipped themselves. Militias were very important from the establishment of the first English colonies, and they would remain important through the American Revolutionary War. They're inexpensive, they're easy to raise, but at the same time their discipline level is low, and there's a loss of manpower when militias are called up. They have to leave their civilian occupations, which causes problems for colonial societies and eventually for the patriots during the American Revolutionary War. We'll discuss the militia in later videos and its role in the American Revolutionary War. The technology, arms, and equipment used by these troops would change significantly from the 1600s to the 1700s. In the early 1600s, soldiers and militiamen were wearing armor. They were using heavy, unreliable flintlock muskets, but over time they began to develop the skulking way of war, stealth-based tactics. They're using flintlock muskets, which are much more reliable and accurate than the matchlocks. They're not using armor as much in the late 1600s and in the 1700s because the Native Americans they're fighting are using flintlock muskets. Armor is not good protection against flintlock muskets. In addition to the militias, the colonies will also use rangers. Rangers showed a great degree of cultural syncretism in how they equipped themselves and in their strategy and tactics. They were the first to learn stealth-based warfare. It takes the militias longer to learn stealth or the skulking way of war. And the militias and the rangers will be used alongside provincial troops in the French and Indian War. The provincial troops were more like professional soldiers. They would volunteer for terms of service. They would have their arms and equipment provided for them. And the provincial troops would form the basis of the Continental Army used during the American Revolutionary War by the Patriots. Although the Patriots would also use militias and rangers as well. We'll talk more about the American Revolutionary War in future videos.